bonfires burning while your hearts are yearning, though your lads are far away, they dream of home.
They actually did preserve everything they could. You'd have your meats, a fish. Fish could be smoked. They would salt it first of all, and then they'd dry smoke it up the chimney, anywhere. Over a fire, they'd make a little oven. And smoking became quite a big thing. That was another natural way of preserving. Pickles were pickled in, everything was pickled. They'd pickle fruit, they'd pickle onions, they'd pickle onions. And they would sort of use the same procedure then. Vinegar with a few spices. The stuff would be brined first. Obviously the procedure was to get all the moisture out of the raw material so that that didn't weaken your brine solution or your pickle solution. Then there was the other thing that became sort of quite important. How do we preserve eggs? For instance, they needed eggs for their baking, they needed eggs to feed their babies, they needed eggs as a very good source of protein, and they used isinglass. Now, who knows what isinglass is made from? How many people know what isinglass comes from? Well, I've got one up on you then. Isinglass is a gelatine made from fish. Did you say that? Yeah. Well, why didn't you speak up? I could do with you up here to help me out with this one. Come on, let's do it. So yes, that was eggs. And eggs would be, they would get the isinglass, that would be dissolved in a warm water, cooled off into quite a solution, and the eggs would be dropped into this solution in the shells. And that would preserve those eggs and keep them for between 6 and 9 months. The gelatine formed almost like a varnish around the shell of the egg, but of course it softened the shell with them being in the liquid for such a long time. So they didn't actually boil the eggs, because if they did, the shells would disintegrate. And after a time, the white would become quite sort of liquid, so they didn't use that for cooking, so for whipping. But they could actually shell the eggs out, fry them, do whatever they wanted to, and that was a good way of keeping eggs. And, you know, it still works. People do it. Other people preserve them in vinegar. I preserved a few myself, but we used to sort of do pickled eggs, and they would keep very well boiled, hard-boiled, shelled, and in vinegar. So that's sort of given you a brief idea as to how they preserve their fish, their meat, and their eggs, which basically is their protein, I suppose. Then you'd come on to your vegetables and things like that. Obviously, in the Vale there is an abundance of vegetables, and we've all, I suppose, I can still remember, because I'm quite old really. I can remember when the aunties and the grandmothers and people like that used to slice the runner beans and put them in salt. They'd get the big, who can remember them going in the big sweet jars? Layers, there you go. I bet you've done a few, haven't you? And it's surprising how well they kept. Only trouble was you'd have to boil them about 3 or 4 times to get the salt out, wouldn't you? Yeah, but it worked. And so that was sort of a dry preservation. Then they'd make a brine, which was again a very heavy solution of salt and water, with perhaps a little pinch of saltpetre. They used it all the time then, because they were paranoid about keeping things. And so you'd have your brine vegetables. Then they would pickle vegetables. I remember my father once thinking that he was sort of quite good at this. He must have remembered his mother doing it. He decided he was going to pickle cauliflower. I'll tell you, I've never tasted anything so horrible ever in my life. But he had all this cauliflower in a heavy brine solution, and then he pickled it in vinegar, and it, you know, went dark brown, and it just tasted like vinegar. He had no idea. And but they would do that with their fruits. They dried fruits. They would dry apples, pears, anything that they could dry, they would dry. Then you'd get the softer fruits. Again, those were sterilised. So do you know how you sterilize? How did they sterilise the fruit then? Yeah, that's it. They'd put them in a jar and boil the jars up in water, which would produce a vacuum, and then they would keep forever. So your raspberries, plums, God, in the Vale of Evesham, everybody had jars and cupboards full of plums. And that, you know, it's true. And so they were preserved like that. Again, they would then perhaps move on to oil. If they could get hold of some oil, they would preserve in oil. They'd get the tomatoes and they'd dry them off in the oven. They'd keep them in jars of oil and things like that. You know, there's so many ways of preserving food, and they use every which way to do that. What else did they preserve? Mushrooms, for instance. In September time, when there was an abundance of field mushrooms, we pay a fortune now to buy dried mushrooms. They used to get them, put them on top of the stove, you know, or around the fire, dry the mushrooms, and then they'd bring them back, wouldn't they, with a drop of water. And it worked for years and years and years. And that was it, really. You know, it was all about frugality to conserve, preserve, and save.